the inheritance came with a funeral, a flag, and a garage full of ghosts. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Marcus Webb stood at the edge of the cemetery, his dress uniform feeling tighter than it had at any parade or ceremony. The October wind cut across the Iowa plains, rattling the oak trees and sending dry leaves tumbling over fresh-turned earth. 37 mourners had gathered to say goodbye to Henry Webb, a man who had lived 89 years without ever leaving Johnson County, a man whose hands had shaped metal and minds in equal measure. Marcus had been back in the States for 6 weeks. Back from 12 years of deployments, desert heat, and the kind of silence that follows explosions. He'd planned to visit his grandfather eventually, maybe at Christmas, maybe when he figured out what came next for a combat engineer with a bad knee and no clear path forward. But the call had come first. Pneumonia, quick and merciless, had taken Henry before Marcus could say the things he'd rehearsed during long nights in forward operating bases. The pastor spoke about legacy and faith, about a man who built engines and mentored boys who had no fathers. Marcus barely heard it. His eyes kept drifting to the modest headstone being prepared next to his grandmother's plot, the woman he'd never met but whose smile lived in old photographs throughout his grandfather's house. After the service, neighbors approached with condolences and casseroles, their weathered faces kind but curious. They'd known Marcus as a boy, before the army, before he became someone who could dismantle roadside bombs but couldn't hold down a conversation at the grocery store without scanning exits. "Your granddad was real proud of you," said Mrs. Patterson, who ran the hardware store on Main Street. "Showed everyone the letters you sent, even when they got few and far between." Marcus nodded, throat tight. The letters had stopped almost entirely after his third tour. What could he write about? How the sand got into everything. How he'd watched good men die for reasons that made less sense the longer he stayed. The lawyer, a thin man named Carlson with wire-rimmed glasses and a briefcase that had seen better decades, approached as the crowd thinned. "Mr. Webb, when you have a moment, we should discuss your grandfather's estate. Nothing elaborate, but there are matters that require your attention." They met that afternoon in Carlson's office above the pharmacy, where the smell of old paper mixed with antiseptic from below. The will was straightforward, drafted 20 years earlier and never amended. Henry Webb's entire estate, such as it was, passed to his only grandson. The house on Ridgeline Road. The 2 acres it sat on. And Webb's automotive, the garage that had been the heart of his grandfather's life for over 60 years. "The property is paid off," Carlson explained, sliding documents across his desk. "No mortgage, though there are outstanding property taxes, about $8,000. The garage has been closed for 3 years since your grandfather's health declined. There's equipment inside, some of it quite old but potentially valuable to collectors." He paused, studying Marcus over his glasses. "I should mention there have been inquiries." "Inquiries?" "About purchasing the property. The garage sits on prime commercial land now that the highway expansion is complete. A development company has expressed interest. Their offer is, well, substantial for property in this area." Carlson produced another document. $250,000. The number hung in the air like smoke. Marcus had been living on military pay, most of which he'd saved because there was nothing to spend it on in war zones. He had maybe $40,000 in the bank and a disability check coming each month that barely covered rent on the apartment he'd been crashing in outside Fort Carson. $250,000 could change everything. Could give him breathing room to figure out what came next. "How long do I have to decide?" They'd prefer an answer within 30 days, but legally, you can take as long as you need. "The property is yours free and clear." Carlson leaned back in his chair. "Though I should warn you, Mr. Webb. Property taxes will continue accumulating. In that old garage, it'll need upkeep if you plan to hold on to it. Buildings don't do well sitting empty." Marcus took the keys that afternoon, 2 simple brass keys on a ring his grandfather had probably carried for decades. The house key was worn smooth from use. The garage key still had sharp edges, as if it had been cut more recently, though that seemed unlikely given Henry's declining health. The house stood at the end of Ridgeline Road, a white clapboard farmhouse that had probably been handsome 50 years ago. Now the paint was peeling, the porch sagged slightly on the right side, and the gutters overflowed with seasons of neglected leaves. But the oak tree in the front yard still stood massive and ancient, the same tree Marcus had climbed as a boy during summer visits that had grown shorter and less frequent as he got older. Inside, everything was exactly as he remembered and somehow smaller. The living room with its brick fireplace and mantel crowded with photographs. The kitchen with yellow countertops and a table that seated 4 but had only ever held 2. His grandfather's recliner, worn at the arms, still angled toward the television. Marcus moved through the rooms like a ghost, touching surfaces, opening drawers, finding the archaeology of a life lived simply. Bills paid and filed by month. Grocery lists in shaky handwriting. A calendar from 2019 still hanging in the kitchen, the last year his grandfather had been well enough to track days. The bedroom was harder. The bed was made with military precision, something his grandfather had learned in Korea and never forgotten. On the nightstand sat a framed photograph of a young couple, his grandparents on their wedding day, both impossibly young and full of futures they couldn't yet imagine. Beside it, a more recent photo, Marcus in his dress uniform and his basic training graduation, squared away and serious, 22 and certain he was doing the right thing. He found the letters in the top dresser drawer, every single one he'd sent over 12 years, organized chronologically and kept in their original envelopes. Some were thick, written during the early deployments when he still believed he could explain what he was experiencing. Others were thin, a single page or less, written during the years when words failed him entirely. His grandfather had kept them all. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Darkness was falling when Marcus finally walked the dirt path to the garage. It sat 200 yards behind the house, a large metal building with a rolling door and a regular entry on the side. The structure was solid, built to last, with none of the deterioration visible on the main house. His grandfather had always maintained his workspace, even when everything else slipped. The key turned smoothly in the lock, and Marcus stepped into the smell of old motor oil, metal, and something else, the particular scent of a place where work had mattered. He found the light switch, and fluorescent tubes flickered to life, revealing a space frozen in time. Workbenches lined the walls, tools hung on pegboards in careful arrangement, each outline traced so you knew exactly where it belonged. A lift stood in the center bay, though no car waited beneath it. Parts and equipment filled metal shelving units, organized with the same precision Marcus had learned in the military but recognized now as something his grandfather had taught him first. The office was a small room in the back corner, just big enough for a desk, a filing cabinet, and a coffee maker that probably hadn't brewed a cup in years. Marcus sat in the creaky desk chair and opened the top drawer. More files, more organization. Service records for vehicles long since scrapped. Receipts dating back to the 1970s. And beneath it all, a leather-bound journal, the kind with unlined pages that invited handwriting instead of typing. Marcus opened it carefully. His grandfather's handwriting filled the pages, strong and clear in the early entries, growing shakier in the later ones. But these weren't business records. These were stories. June 3, 1985. Fixed the Patterson boy's truck today, transmission was shot. Told him about Korea, about keeping your head down and your rifle clean. He ships out for basic next week. Hope he comes back whole. September 12, 1997. Marcus helped me rebuild the carburetor today. 8 years old and his hands already know how things fit together. Reminds me of his father at that age, before everything went wrong. Marcus's chest tightened. His father, Henry's son, had died when Marcus was 6. A car accident that wasn't quite an accident, whiskey and a bridge that didn't have rails. It was a loss his grandfather had carried alongside his own grief. April 22, 2003. Marcus joined the army. Told me he wants to serve something bigger than himself. I understand that. Korea was the same for me. But I wish I could tell him what it costs, what it takes from you that you don't get back. I'll write to him every week. It's all I can do. The entries continued, documenting a life measured not in grand achievements but in small acts of service, vehicles repaired, young men counseled, a community held together by the steady work of hands that refused to quit even when the body grew tired. The final entry was dated 3 months before Henry's death. Can't work anymore. Hands shake too much. But I can still remember. I can still write this down so someone knows. The garage holds more than tools. Beneath the third bay, under the concrete, there's something I've protected for 60 years. Something my father gave me before he died, made me promise to keep safe. He said it came from his father, from the days when men risked everything for a chance at something better. I'm the last one who knows. When I'm gone, it belongs to Marcus. If he's smart, he'll find it. If he's wise, he'll understand what it means. Marcus read the entry 3 times, his heart rate climbing with each pass. Under the concrete? His grandfather had hidden something beneath the garage floor? He stood, moving back into the main workspace with new eyes. 3 bays. The lift occupied the center bay, bolted to the floor with serious hardware. But the concrete in the third bay, the one farthest from the entrance, looked different. Newer, maybe, or patched at some point. Marcus knelt, running his hands over the surface. There, near the back corner, he felt it, a seam in the concrete, carefully filled but detectable if you knew what to look for. His pulse quickened, the same sensation he'd felt approaching suspicious packages in Iraq, that mix of dread and necessity. He needed tools. The garage provided, a pry bar, a sledgehammer, work gloves. Marcus positioned himself at the seam and began to work, leveraging the pry bar into the narrow gap. The concrete resisted, then cracked, revealing that this section was only a few inches thick, a cap rather than a full pour. 20 minutes of work opened a space large enough to see what lay beneath. A metal box, military surplus from the look of it, about 3 feet long and 2 feet wide. Waterproof. Designed to last. Marcus cleared more concrete, hands shaking now from something other than exertion. The box had a simple clasp, no lock. He opened it. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, were objects that made no sense. A leather pouch that clinked with weight. Documents in protective sleeves, yellowed with age. A photograph of 3 men standing beside a wooden sluice box, their clothes and equipment marking them as miners from another century. And a journal, smaller than the one on the desk but bound in the same style. Marcus opened the leather pouch first. Gold coins spilled into his palm, catching the fluorescent light with a glow that seemed impossible. 20, 30, 40 coins, each one stamped with dates from the 1850s and mint marks from San Francisco. His breath caught. The documents were claims, mining claims filed in California in 1852 under the name William Webb. The handwriting was formal, legal, witnessed by officials of a territory not yet fully governed. The claims covered parcels along the American River, land that had probably been panned clean of gold a century and a half ago. But it was the photograph that made Marcus sink to the concrete floor. 3 men, their faces weathered and determined. The one in the middle, taller than the others, had eyes Marcus recognized. The same shape, the same intensity he saw in his grandfather's photographs, in his own reflection. William Webb. His great-great-great-grandfather. A 49er who'd gone west with thousands of others chasing fortune in the Sierra foothills. The smaller journal contained entries in a precise hand, documenting not daily life but something more specific. Coordinates. Measurements. Descriptions of landscape features that meant nothing to Marcus but had clearly mattered enormously to William Webb. June 15, 1852. Moved the cache to higher ground. Winter floods proved the valley location unwise. New site is marked by 3 sister pines above the granite outcrop. 40 paces due east, then 20 north. Buried 8 feet down beneath the red clay layer. 140 pounds. More than enough to secure the family's future if retrieved wisely. Marcus's hands trembled as he turned pages. More entries, more descriptions, all pointing to the same conclusion. William Webb had found gold, substantial gold, and instead of spending it or losing it to thieves or bad investments, he'd hidden it. Buried it in the California wilderness with the intention of returning when circumstances were safer, when the chaos of the gold rush had settled. But he'd never returned. According to family stories Marcus barely remembered, William had died in 1854, killed in a mining accident or possibly murdered. No one knew for certain. The gold, if it had ever existed, had passed into legend, another lost treasure story that families told themselves when money got tight. Except it wasn't a legend. The journal was real. The claims were real. The coins in his hand were real. Marcus sat in the quiet garage, surrounded by his grandfather's tools and his ancestors' secrets, and understood what Henry's final journal entry had meant. This wasn't just about gold. It was about legacy, about the things men pass down when they believe their descendants will honor what came before. His phone buzzed, startling him. A text from an unknown number. "Mr. Webb, this is David Harding with Crestview Development. We're the company interested in your grandfather's property. I wanted to personally reach out to see if you'd be willing to meet this week to discuss our offer. We're prepared to be very flexible on terms." Marcus stared at the message, then at the gold coins still scattered across the concrete, then at the journal that might lead to something far more valuable than $250,000. The garage suddenly felt different. Not empty, but full. Full of history, full of possibility, full of choices that would define what kind of man he was going to be. He could sell. Take the money. Walk away from Johnson County and never look back. Start fresh somewhere else with enough capital to build whatever life he wanted. Or he could stay. Honor what his grandfather had protected. Follow the thread his great-great-great-grandfather had left buried in the California hills. Outside, the October wind picked up, rattling the metal walls like a distant drumbeat. Inside, Marcus Webb gathered the coins, the documents, the journals, and placed them carefully back in the military surplus box. He closed the lid, hearing the clasp click with finality. Then he pulled out his phone and began to research mining claims, historical property rights, and metal detectors capable of finding gold buried 8 feet deep in Sierra Nevada clay. The inheritance had come with a funeral, a flag, and a garage full of ghosts. But it also came with a map, a mystery, and a choice that would require every skill he'd learned in 12 years of diffusing explosives. Because some treasures weren't meant to be found quickly. Some required patience, precision, and the willingness to risk everything for something that might not even exist anymore. Marcus locked the garage and walked back to the farmhouse under a sky now brilliant with stars. Somewhere in California, beneath 3 sister pines and 40 paces east of a granite outcrop, his family's fortune waited. Whether it was still there after 170 years was a question only dirt and determination could answer. But for the first time since coming home from war, Marcus Webb knew exactly what his next mission was. Marcus spent the next 3 days learning everything he could about California mining claims, historical land rights, and the logistics of treasure hunting in national forests. The garage became his command center, the desk cluttered with printed maps, geological surveys, and notes scrawled on legal pads at 2 in the morning when sleep refused to come. The gold coins sat in a locked drawer, but he'd photographed them extensively. Online forums suggested they were worth between $800 and $1,500 each, depending on condition and rarity. 42 coins total. Maybe $50,000 if he sold them immediately. A fortune to William Webb in 1852. Barely enough to cover property taxes and 6 months of living expenses in 2024. But the cash William described, 140 pounds of gold, was different mathematics entirely. At current market prices, that much gold would be worth over $3 million. Enough to change everything. Enough to make the developer's offer look like pocket change. If it still existed. If Marcus could find it. If 170 years of erosion, development, and other treasure hunters hadn't gotten there first. He was measuring distances on a topographical map of the American River watershed when someone knocked on the garage's side door. Marcus tensed, hand instinctively moving toward his hip where he'd once carried a sidearm. Old habits, hard to break. Through the window, he saw a woman, mid-40s maybe, wearing a business suit that looked out of place against the rural backdrop. He opened the door cautiously. "Mr. Webb? I'm Jennifer Harding. I work with my husband David at Crestview Development." She offered a professional smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "I hope I'm not intruding. We hadn't heard back about our message, and since I was in the area, I thought I'd stop by personally." "I've been busy settling the estate," Marcus said, not opening the door wider. "Haven't made any decisions yet." "Of course, and we completely understand. Loss is difficult." Her eyes moved past him, taking in what she could see of the garage interior. "I actually grew up not far from here. My father brought his truck to your grandfather for repairs. Henry was a remarkable man." The personal touch felt calculated, but Marcus kept his expression neutral. "What exactly does Crestview want with the property?" "We're developing a commercial plaza, retail and dining, to serve the traffic from the new highway interchange. Your grandfather's land is perfectly positioned. We've already acquired the adjoining parcels, but this lot is the keystone of the project." She pulled a folder from her briefcase. "We've revised our offer. $300,000. And we'd be willing to close within 2 weeks. $50,000 more than the original offer. Enough to make most people stop and consider seriously." Marcus took the folder but didn't open it. "I'll think about it." Jennifer's smile tightened slightly. "Mr. Webb, I should be direct. We have investors expecting movement on this project. If we can't acquire your property through negotiation, there are other options. The county has eminent domain authority for economic development purposes, especially for blighted properties that pose safety hazards." The threat was delivered politely, but it was unmistakable. "Sell or be forced out." "The property isn't blighted," Marcus said quietly. "And I'm not sure a commercial plaza qualifies as legitimate public use for eminent domain." "Perhaps not. But legal battles are expensive and time-consuming. Meanwhile, property taxes continue accumulating." She handed him a business card. "We're reasonable people, Mr. Webb. We just want to build something that benefits the community. Think about it." After she left, Marcus stood in the garage doorway, watching her Mercedes navigate the rutted driveway. The visit had been a warning shot. Crestview wasn't going to wait patiently while he figured things out. He called the only person he knew who might understand what he'd found. Trevor Hicks had served in Marcus's platoon, a kid from Nevada who'd grown up hearing mining stories from his grandfather. They'd stayed in touch sporadically after discharge, the kind of military friendship that could survive months of silence. "Webb, you son of a gun," Trevor answered on the second ring. "Thought you fell off the planet." "Close. I'm in Iowa, inherited my grandfather's place." Marcus hesitated, unsure how much to reveal. "Found something weird." "You still interested in old mining claims?" "Always." "What kind of weird?" Marcus described the journal, the coordinates, the cash notation, carefully omitting the specific details and the gold coins. Trevor listened without interrupting, his breathing the only sound on the line. "You're talking about a gold rush cache," Trevor finally said. "Man, those are like unicorns. Everyone's grandfather supposedly buried gold somewhere. 99% of the time, it's just family mythology. And the other 1%? Gets interesting. But finding it? That's the hard part. California's been picked over for 170 years. Plus, a lot of that land is protected now, state parks, national forests. You can't just show up with a backhoe. What if I could narrow down the location? Had good coordinates and landmarks?" Trevor was quiet for a moment. "You'd need permits, probably. Or you'd need to be real quiet about what you're doing. Metal detecting is legal in most places, but active excavation gets complicated." He paused. "How solid is your information?" "Solid enough that I'm thinking about taking a trip west." "Then you need gear. A good metal detector, ground-penetrating radar if you can afford it, and someone who knows the territory. Trevor's voice changed, took on an edge of excitement. I'm between jobs right now. Contract work dried up last month. I could meet you out there, help you search. Split whatever we find. Marcus had anticipated the offer. Trevor was a good man, reliable in a firefight, but Marcus had seen what money did to people. Seen friendships dissolve over far less than $3 million in gold. Let me think about it, Marcus said. I need to do more research first, make sure this isn't a waste of time. After hanging up, Marcus returned to the journal, reading William's entries with new urgency. The coordinates were specific, latitude and longitude calculated using 19th-century surveying methods. Modern GPS might get him close, but the real landmarks were what mattered. 3 sister pines, a granite outcrop, red clay at 8 feet. How many of those landmarks still existed? Pines lived maybe 500 years in ideal conditions, but fires, logging, and development had transformed California's landscape. The granite would still be there, probably, but exposed rock could be buried or blasted away. He needed to see the site himself. Needed to understand what he was dealing with before making promises or plans. The house phone rang that evening, the landline his grandfather had kept for reasons Marcus didn't fully understand. He almost didn't answer, expecting telemarketers or political calls, but something made him pick up. Is this Marcus Webb? A man's voice, older, with an accent Marcus couldn't quite place. Who's asking? My name is Samuel Torres. I'm calling about your grandfather's property. I understand there may be items of historical significance on the premises. Marcus's grip tightened on the phone. Where did you hear that? I represent a group of investors interested in Gold Rush-era artifacts and documentation. We've been tracking certain family lineages, descendants of 49ers who may have preserved materials from that period. Torres spoke carefully, as if choosing each word. The Webb family has a documented history in the California goldfields. We'd be willing to pay substantially for any journals, maps, or claims you might have inherited. Not interested in selling family documents. Mr. Webb, I don't think you understand the value of what you may possess. Original Gold Rush materials can be worth tens of thousands to the right collectors. And if those materials contain actionable information that could lead to actual recovery of period assets, the value increases exponentially. How did you get this number? Torres ignored the question. We're prepared to offer $200,000 for any Gold Rush-related materials in your possession. Sight unseen. No questions asked about provenance or content. It was too much money for old paper. Way too much unless Torres knew or suspected what those papers might lead to. Who are you really? Marcus asked. Someone who appreciates history and is willing to pay for it. Think about our offer, Mr. Webb. $200,000 is more than most people see in years. Certainly more than that property is worth. The line went dead. Marcus stood holding the phone, his mind racing. Jennifer Harding showing up in person. Samuel Torres calling with an impossible offer. Neither knew about the cash specifically, but both were circling like sharks who'd smelled blood in the water. Someone had talked. Someone knew he'd found something. He thought about the funeral, the neighbors who'd come through the house afterward with their casseroles and condolences. The lawyer who'd handled the estate. Any of them could have known about Henry's journal, about the family history. Or maybe it was simpler. Maybe men like Torres made a business of contacting descendants of 49ers, playing the odds that eventually they'd hit someone with real information. Either way, Marcus was running out of time to make this decision alone. He drove into town the next morning, stopping at Patterson's Hardware for supplies. The store hadn't changed since his childhood, still smelled like sawdust and machine oil, still had the same creaky wooden floors. Mrs. Patterson looked up from the register, her face breaking into a warm smile. Marcus. Good to see you getting out. How are you managing? Getting by. Need some tools. He grabbed a basket and started down the aisles, selecting items carefully. A quality metal detector, the kind used for serious treasure hunting, would cost thousands he didn't have. But a decent handheld model, good enough for initial site assessment, ran about $300. At the register, Mrs. Patterson rang up his purchases without comment: metal detector, batteries, work gloves, a collapsible shovel. Then she leaned forward conspiratorially. "People have been asking about you. Strangers. One man came in 2 days ago, wanted to know if you'd been buying any unusual equipment." She glanced at the metal detector. "I told him we value customer privacy." "What did he look like?" "50s, expensive clothes. Had an accent, maybe Spanish or Portuguese. Left me his card in case I changed my mind about helping him." She pulled a business card from beneath the register. "Samuel Torres, Historical Asset Recovery." "He's looking for something," Mrs. Patterson said quietly. "Something he thinks your granddad had." Henry never mentioned it, but toward the end, he got real careful about who he talked to. Stopped telling those old stories about his father and grandfather. Marcus pocketed the card. "Did my grandfather ever talk to you about California? About the gold rush? Years ago, when you were little. He'd tell stories about Wild William, that's what he called his grandfather. Said William went west with nothing and came back with enough to buy land, though he died before he could enjoy it much." She paused. There were always rumors that William had struck it rich but hidden the gold, planning to retrieve it later. But those are just stories families tell themselves. Marcus paid for his purchases and drove back to the house, checking his mirrors more carefully than necessary. No one followed, but the paranoia from his military service had kicked in, that heightened awareness that kept you alive in hostile territory. The garage felt different now, less like a sanctuary and more like a target. He moved William's box to a new hiding spot, beneath the floorboards in the house's basement, then covered his tracks carefully. That night, he made his decision. He booked a flight to Sacramento, departing in 3 days. Rented a truck and basic camping gear. Purchased detailed topographical maps of the American River drainage. And sent a careful message to Trevor, declining the offer of help but asking for advice on metal detecting in the Sierra foothills. The reply came within an hour, longer than expected and more detailed. Trevor explained ground conditions, mineral interference, the difference between placer gold and lode deposits. Then, almost as an afterthought, "If you're really going, watch yourself. Treasure hunting brings out weird people." Had a buddy who found a small cache in Nevada. Within a week, he had people following him, making threats, trying to cut deals. The gold makes people crazy. Marcus read the message twice, filed it away with everything else he was learning about a world he'd never imagined entering. The next morning brought an unexpected visitor. Marcus was loading gear into his truck when a sheriff's patrol car pulled up the driveway. Deputy Collins, a guy Marcus remembered from high school, climbed out with the practiced casualness of someone delivering bad news. "Marcus. Heard you were back in town." "Deputy." Marcus kept his hands visible, another old habit. "Something wrong?" "Got a complaint filed yesterday. Crestview Development claims you've been making threats, interfering with their business operations." Collins looked uncomfortable. "I told them it sounded like garbage, but I had to follow up." "You have any contact with Jennifer Harding?" "She came here trying to pressure me into selling." I declined politely. "That's what I figured." Collins relaxed slightly. "Look, off the record? Crestview's been pushing hard to assemble that commercial development. They've got county commissioners in their pocket, maybe the mayor too. If you're planning to hold on to this property, expect them to make trouble." "Noted." Collins glanced at the truck, the gear visible through the windows. "Going somewhere?" "Taking a trip. Need to clear my head." "Good idea. Sometimes distance helps." He handed Marcus a card. "My personal cell. You run into problems, legal problems, call me first. Your grandfather did a lot for this town. People remember that." After the deputy left, Marcus sat in the truck, engine running, hands gripping the wheel. Everything was escalating faster than he'd anticipated. The pressure to sell, the mysterious calls, now official complaints designed to create a legal paper trail. Crestview wanted the land badly enough to play dirty. Torres wanted the documents badly enough to offer obscene money. And Marcus, caught in the middle, had to decide whether chasing a 170-year-old treasure was wisdom or madness. His phone buzzed. Another unknown number, another text. "Mr. Webb, this is David Harding. We need to talk urgently about your property. There are complications you're not aware of. Please call me." Marcus deleted the message without responding. He thought about his grandfather, working in his garage for 60 years. Thought about Henry reading his letters from war zones, saving every single one even when they said nothing of substance. Thought about William Webb, burying gold in California dirt and never living to reclaim it. 3 generations of men who'd tried to build something lasting. 3 generations who'd protected what mattered, even when the cost was high. Marcus put the truck in gear and drove to the bank, where he deposited the gold coins in a safety deposit box. Then he stopped at Carlson's office and signed papers giving the lawyer limited power of attorney to handle property matters while he was away. "How long will you be gone?" Carlson asked. "A week, maybe 2. If Crestview files anything legal, call me immediately." "They're persistent. You're sure you don't want to just take their money?" Marcus thought about the question seriously. 300,000 would solve immediate problems, let him start fresh somewhere else. But it would also mean surrendering the last connection to his grandfather, to the family history that had survived through careful protection and quiet determination. "I'm sure." The flight to Sacramento departed before dawn. Marcus watched Iowa disappear beneath clouds, farmland giving way to the checkerboard patterns of industrial agriculture, then the mountains rising like broken teeth against the western sky. He'd been to California once before, a brief layover at Travis Air Force Base on his way to deployment. He'd seen nothing but tarmac and transport planes. Now, descending into Sacramento, he saw the sprawl of civilization, highways carved through hills, developments spreading like floodwater into every available valley. The rental truck was waiting, a beat-up Ford that rattled but ran. Marcus loaded his gear and drove east toward the foothills, following Highway 49 through towns whose names appeared in Williams' journal. Auburn, Cool, Coloma, where James Marshall had found the first gold flakes in 1848. The landscape shifted as he climbed, suburbs giving way to pine forest, modern development interrupted by pockets of wilderness that looked unchanged from gold rush days. He stopped at a ranger station to check regulations, learning that metal detecting was permitted in most areas with restrictions on depth and disturbance. Looking for anything specific, the ranger asked, a woman in her 60s who'd probably heard every treasure hunting story there was. "Family history. My great-great-great-grandfather worked claims around here in the 1850s. Lot of people come through with the same story. Most leave disappointed." She pulled out a map, marking areas where detecting was prohibited. "Respect the boundaries, fill any holes you dig, and don't expect miracles. The easy gold was found 170 years ago." Marcus thanked her and drove deeper into the hills, following coordinates that matched Williams' notations. The American River ran silver and cold through granite canyons, beautiful and indifferent. He passed abandoned mining operations, rusted equipment slowly being reclaimed by forest, and modern homes built on sites where 49ers had once panned for fortune. The Three Sister Pines, if they still existed, should be near a place called Shirttail Creek, a tributary feeding the American River's North Fork. Marcus parked at a trailhead and hiked in, carrying the metal detector and Williams' journal protected in a waterproof case. The forest smelled like resin and earth, clean in a way that made his chest ache. He'd spent 12 years in deserts and urban combat zones. This green silence felt alien and perfect. He found the granite outcrop first, a massive formation rising above the creek bed like a ship's prow. The rock matched Williams' description, distinctive layering visible in the exposed face. 40 paces due east would put him on a steep slope thick with pines. But none of the trees looked old enough. These were second growth, maybe 70 or 80 years, planted or seeded after logging had cleared the original forest. The sister pines William described were gone, cut down or burned in one of the fires that periodically swept through California. Marcus stood on the slope, fighting disappointment. He'd known this was possible, likely even. But some part of him had hoped for a miracle, for the landscape to have preserved itself perfectly across 17 decades. He activated the metal detector anyway, sweeping methodically across the area where William's measurements suggested the cache should be. The device chirped constantly, responding to mineral deposits in the soil, bullet casings from modern hunters, aluminum trash from hikers. Nothing substantial. Nothing that felt right. Hours passed. The sun tracked across the sky, throwing shadows that changed the landscape's character. Marcus expanded his search pattern, working in careful grids, trying to account for surveying errors or changes in the terrain. His phone rang, startling him. No reception here, he'd thought, but a single bar flickered on the screen. Trevor's number. "You there yet?" Trevor asked without preamble. "At the site." "Nothing so far." "Man, I've been thinking about this. That journal you described, if it's real, you need serious help. Ground-penetrating radar, professional survey equipment. Not a $300 metal detector. I'm just doing preliminary reconnaissance." "Marcus." Trevor's voice changed, took on the tone he'd used in combat when something felt wrong. "I did some asking around. There's a group, call themselves Historical Recovery Specialists, who track down gold rush caches. They've got resources, connections with universities and museums. They find stuff, authenticate it, sell it through legitimate channels. But they're also ruthless as hell about protecting their leads." "Samuel Torres?" "That's one of their primary agents." "How'd you know?" "He called me. Offered $200,000 for my documents." Trevor swore creatively. "Then they know you've got something real." "Marcus, these people don't make offers like that unless they're certain. Which means they might already know where the cache is. They just need your journal to confirm it or claim legal ownership." Marcus looked around the empty forest, suddenly aware of how isolated he was. "You think someone followed me here? I think you should watch your back. And maybe consider that there are worse things than selling information to people who know what they're doing." After hanging up, Marcus moved back toward the granite outcrop, processing Trevor's warning. The sun was setting, painting the canyon walls orange and purple. He should hike out, return to the truck, find a motel. Instead, he climbed higher on the slope, looking for vantage points William might have used. The gold rush miners had been practical men, choosing cache sites they could relocate easily, places where natural landmarks provided clear references. That's when he saw it, not three pines, but a granite formation above the outcrop, three spires of rock weathered into shapes that from certain angles looked like reaching fingers. Sister stones instead of sister pines. William's notation made sense now. The pines had been navigation markers, but the real landmark was geological, permanent. 40 paces east from the triple spires, then 20 north toward the red clay layer visible where erosion had exposed the hillside. Marcus practically ran to the new location, his fatigue forgotten. The metal detector sang immediately, a strong, consistent signal 6 feet down. Not the scattered chirps of trash or mineral deposits, but the deep, resonant tone that suggested something large and metallic. His hands shook as he pulled out the collapsible shovel and began to dig. The first foot of earth came away easily, soft topsoil that had accumulated over decades. Then Marcus hit harder ground, clay mixed with granite fragments that resisted the shovel. His shoulders burned, muscles protesting work they hadn't done in years, but he kept digging, driven by something deeper than physical strength. Darkness fell completely, forcing him to work by phone light, the beam casting harsh shadows that made depth perception impossible. Twice he slipped on the steep slope, catching himself on exposed roots. His hands blistered, then bled through the work gloves. He didn't care. At 4 feet down, the metal detector still sang its promising tone. At 5 feet, his shovel struck something that wasn't rock. The sound was different, metallic and hollow. Marcus dropped to his knees, clearing dirt with his hands now, feeling for the edges of whatever lay buried. His fingers found metal, pitted with corrosion but intact. A container of some kind, rectangular and substantial. He cleared more dirt, working by touch as much as sight, until he could grip both sides. It didn't budge. Too heavy to lift, or wedged in by compressed earth and time. Marcus sat back, breathing hard, and checked his phone. Nearly midnight. He'd been digging for 5 hours, lost in the singular focus that had once helped him dismantle explosives while insurgents fired at his position. But he couldn't finish this tonight. Not safely, not alone, not with inadequate tools and failing light. He filled the hole partially, covering the metal container but leaving himself a clear marker. Then he camouflaged the site with branches and loose vegetation, trying to make it look undisturbed to casual observers. The work was sloppy, rushed, nothing like the careful excavation the cache deserved, but dawn would bring hikers and his window of privacy would close. The hike back to the truck took an hour, his legs shaking from exhaustion. Marcus drove until he found a turnout with cell reception, then pulled over and closed his eyes, just for a moment. He woke to sunlight and the sound of someone tapping on his window. A California Highway Patrol officer stood beside the truck, expression neutral but alert. Marcus's heart rate spiked, combat reflexes flooding his system before rational thought caught up. "Morning," the officer said when Marcus rolled down the window. "You okay? You've been parked here a while." Marcus glanced at the dash clock. 8:30 in the morning. He'd slept almost 7 hours. "Yeah, sorry. Long drive yesterday, pulled over to rest." The officer's eyes took in Marcus's appearance, the dirt under his fingernails, the torn gloves on the passenger seat, the metal detector visible in the truck bed. "Doing some prospecting? Visiting family sites. My ancestor worked claims around here during the gold rush. Find anything interesting?" Marcus kept his expression neutral, a skill learned in checkpoints and interrogations. "Mostly trash and old nails. History is buried pretty deep." The officer studied him for a long moment, then stepped back. "Drive safe. And if you're planning more digging, make sure you're on land where it's permitted. A lot of that territory up there is protected." After the patrol car pulled away, Marcus sat gripping the wheel, adrenaline slowly fading. The officer's appearance felt like a warning, coincidence maybe, or maybe not. If Torres had people watching, if Crestview had tracked him somehow, his window for recovering the cash was closing fast. He needed help. Real help, not just enthusiasm and a shovel. Marcus drove to Auburn and found an equipment rental yard that opened at 9. He rented a portable winch, heavy-duty straps, and a gas-powered generator, paying extra for same-day return. Then he stopped at a sporting goods store for proper excavation tools, a real headlamp, and heavy work gloves that wouldn't disintegrate in an hour. By 11, he was back at the trailhead, loading gear into a hiking backpack that probably violated every weight recommendation. The forest felt different in daylight, less mysterious and more mundane. He passed 2 other hikers on the trail, offering friendly nods that they returned without interest. At the cache site, his camouflage had held. Nothing looked disturbed. Marcus unpacked methodically, setting up the generator away from the hole to minimize noise, running the winch cable to a sturdy pine that could serve as an anchor point. Then he resumed digging, working more carefully now, clearing dirt from around the metal container until its full shape emerged. It was a strongbox, the kind used for transporting valuables in the 19th century, maybe 3 feet long and 2 feet in each dimension. Iron construction with reinforced corners, built to last. The lid was sealed with what looked like lead solder, an extra measure to keep moisture out. Marcus rigged the winch straps under the box, testing the connection before applying power. The generator roared to life, obscenely loud in the quiet forest. The winch cable went taut, and for a horrible moment nothing happened. Then the earth surrendered its treasure with a sound like tearing fabric, and the strongbox rose slowly from the red clay that had held it for nearly 2 centuries. Marcus killed the generator the instant the box cleared the hole. In the sudden silence, his breathing sounded ragged and too fast. He knelt beside the strongbox, hands trembling, and tried the lid. Locked, the mechanism corroded but still functional. He'd anticipated this. The pry bar made quick work of the ancient lock, metal shrieking as it gave way. Marcus lifted the lid. Gold. Not coins, not nuggets, but bars. Rough cast ingots stamped with assayer's marks and dates from 1851 and 1852. They lay in neat rows, packed in oilcloth that had mostly rotted away. Marcus counted them carefully. 27 bars, each roughly the size of a brick but far heavier. His hands shook as he lifted one out. The metal was cool and dense, unmarred by time. The stamp read SF Assay Office with a weight notation of 5 pounds. At current gold prices, 5 pounds was worth maybe $120,000. Times 27 bars. Over $3 million. Buried in California dirt while William Webb died in a mining accident, while his son struggled to make the Iowa farm profitable, while Henry Webb worked 60 years in a garage to keep the family afloat, while Marcus deployed again and again to wars that made less sense each time. $3 million in gold that could have changed everything for 4 generations of Webbs. And it had waited here, patient and useless, because William never made it back to reclaim what he'd earned. Marcus sat heavily on the edge of the excavation, one gold bar still in his hands, and felt something break open in his chest. Not joy, not triumph, but grief for all the struggling and sacrifice that this gold could have prevented. His grandfather working through pain and illness because he couldn't afford to retire. His father drinking himself to death because he couldn't see a future worth staying sober for. Marcus himself, enlisting because college seemed impossible and the army promised structure and purpose. All of it unnecessary. All of it endured because William Webb's luck had run out before he could deliver this fortune to the family he'd left behind in Iowa. The tears came without warning, silent and overwhelming. Marcus let them fall, too exhausted to fight the emotion. He cried for his grandfather, for the father he'd barely known, for the versions of himself that had died in desert cities whose names he could barely pronounce. He cried for William Webb, who'd risked everything and won, only to lose it all anyway. When the tears finally stopped, Marcus felt emptied out and strangely clear. He carefully repacked the gold bars, noting that the strongbox had a second, smaller compartment beneath the main cache. Inside, wrapped in waxed canvas that had survived better than the oilcloth, he found documents. The original mining claims, properly filed and witnessed. A letter addressed to my beloved Sarah and our children, dated May 1853, describing the cache location and expressing hope for a reunion that never came. And a worn leather notebook containing what appeared to be William's final journal entries. Marcus read the letter first, his ancestors' handwriting strong and optimistic despite the hardships described. William had planned to return to Iowa that fall, to buy prime farmland and build a house worthy of the family he'd left behind. He wrote about missing his wife's laugh, about wondering if his son still remembered his face, about dreams of a prosperous future built on the fortune he'd secured through luck and brutal labor. The journal entries were darker, documenting the increasing violence in the mining camps, the claim jumping and murders that had become routine as the easy gold disappeared. William's final entry, dated June 14, 1854, mentioned threats from a rival claim holder, a man named Dalton who'd been pressuring several successful miners to sell out. Marcus closed the notebook, understanding finally how his ancestor had died. Not an accident. Murder, probably, committed by someone who'd assumed William's gold was still in camp or deposited in a bank. They'd killed him for treasure he'd already hidden, had already protected against exactly this kind of betrayal. The parallel wasn't lost on Marcus. Torres and his associates, Crestview Development, even Trevor's warnings about treasure hunters, all pointed to the same truth. Wealth attracted predators, and the more you had, the more dangerous they became. He needed to move fast. Needed to get the gold somewhere secure before word spread that he'd actually found something. Marcus rigged a makeshift sled from branches and strapping, loading the strongbox onto it. The hike back to the truck took 3 hours, the weight and awkward bulk making every step treacherous on the steep terrain. By the time he reached the trailhead, His back screamed and his hands were ribbons of blisters, but the gold was secure in the truck bed, covered with a tarp and camping gear. He drove straight to Sacramento, to a private storage facility that offered climate-controlled units with serious security. The attendant barely glanced at the strongbox as Marcus wheeled it in on a dolly, just another customer storing valuables. Marcus paid cash for 6 months, using a false name he'd prepared in advance. Only after the storage unit was locked and the gold was behind multiple layers of security did Marcus allow himself to breathe. He found a motel, showered until the water ran clear, and collapsed onto the bed, asleep before his head fully hit the pillow. His phone woke him at dawn. Multiple missed calls from Iowa. Carlson, the lawyer. Mrs. Patterson from the hardware store. Deputy Collins. And 3 voicemails from a number Marcus didn't recognize. He called Carlson first. "Marcus, thank God. Where are you?" The lawyer's voice was tight with stress. "California." "What's wrong?" "Crestview filed an emergency petition with the county yesterday. They're claiming the garage contains hazardous materials, old automotive fluids and chemicals that pose environmental risks. They got an order for immediate inspection and remediation, which essentially means they can enter the property today." Marcus's grip tightened on the phone. "On what grounds?" "Anonymous complaint, supposedly from a concerned neighbor. But the timing is suspicious, and the judge who signed the order is the same one who's approved all of Crestview's development permits." Carlson paused. "Marcus, I think they're looking for something specific. This isn't about environmental compliance." "The documents," Marcus said quietly. "They want Williams' journal and the mining claims." "What documents?" Marcus made a decision. "I'll explain when I get back." "How long can you stall them?" "Maybe 48 hours if I file objections and request proper notification procedures." "But Marcus, if there actually are hazardous materials on the property, we don't have much legal ground to stand on." "There aren't. The garage is cleaner than most hospital operating rooms. My grandfather was meticulous. Then we have a case for harassment and improper procedure. But you need to get back here before they manufacture evidence or create violations." Marcus booked the next flight to Des Moines, a red-eye that would get him home by early afternoon. Before leaving Sacramento, he stopped at a bank and rented a safety deposit box under his real name, depositing Williams' original documents, the letter to Sarah, and the final journal. The gold would stay in the storage unit for now, anonymous and secure. The flight gave him time to think, to plan, to understand what he was really dealing with. Crestview didn't just want the land. They wanted to erase any claim Marcus might have to resources or rights connected to Williams' California holdings. And Torres, representing his mysterious consortium of historical asset recovery specialists, wanted to control the narrative and the profits from whatever William had found. Both groups had underestimated Marcus Webb. Had seen a struggling veteran, broken, desperate, easy to manipulate or intimidate. They hadn't counted on 12 years of military training that taught him how to operate under pressure, how to recognize threats, and how to protect what mattered. Deputy Collins met him at the Des Moines airport, out of uniform and looking grim. "Appreciate the ride," Marcus said, throwing his bag in the back seat. "We need to talk before you get to the property." Collins pulled into traffic, heading east toward Johnson County. Crestview's inspection team showed up yesterday with the county environmental officer. "I happened to be driving past, completely by coincidence, and stopped to observe." "Find anything?" "They tried. Brought in testing equipment, took samples of everything. But your grandfather's garage is so clean they couldn't manufacture violations even if they wanted to." The environmental officer actually complimented the organization and proper disposal practices. Collins glanced at Marcus. "But while they were searching, I saw one of the Crestview people taking photographs of the office area, the desk, the filing cabinets. They weren't looking for environmental hazards. They were documenting what's not there anymore." "What did you take, Marcus?" "Family papers. Historical documents that belong to me, not to anyone trying to steal the property." Collins nodded slowly. "Here's what I know. Crestview has put serious money into this development. County commissioners are expecting tax revenue. Local business owners are excited about growth. There's a lot of pressure to make this project happen. And I'm the obstacle. You're the last holdout. But Marcus, you've also got support. People who remember what your grandfather meant to this community. Mrs. Patterson started a petition yesterday, got 200 signatures in 4 hours. They're demanding the county reject any eminent domain proceedings. The information settled something in Marcus's chest. He wasn't alone in this fight, even if he'd felt isolated for so long. The garage looked unchanged when they arrived, but Marcus could see signs of the inspection. Disturbed dust, moved tools, filing cabinet drawers not quite closed the way his grandfather would have left them. He went directly to the basement hiding spot and confirmed what he already knew. The military surplus box was exactly where he'd left it, untouched because Crestview's people hadn't known to look there. Inside, the gold coins remained secure, along with copies of William's documents. Marcus spent the rest of the day securing the property properly, installing new locks, setting up motion-activated cameras he ordered for same-day delivery. Deputy Collins helped, off the clock and unofficial, because some things mattered more than regulations. That evening, Marcus called a meeting in his grandfather's garage. Carlson the lawyer, Mrs. Patterson, Deputy Collins, and Thomas Brennan, a reporter from the county newspaper who'd covered Henry Webb's obituary with unusual care and respect. "I'm going to tell you something that needs to stay confidential until I say otherwise," Marcus began. He laid out the story systematically, showing them copies of William's journal, photographs of the gold bars, and documentation of everything he'd found. He explained about Torres and the pressure to sell documents. About Crestview's aggressive tactics. About the choice he was facing. When he finished, silence filled the garage. Mrs. Patterson spoke first. "Your grandfather knew, didn't he? About the gold?" "He protected the information," Marcus confirmed. "Waited for the right person to inherit it. Someone who'd understand what it meant." "What does it mean to you?" Brennan asked, reporter's notebook open but pen still. Marcus had been asking himself the same question since the moment he'd opened the strongbox. "It means my family doesn't have to struggle anymore. It means I can honor my grandfather's legacy by keeping this property instead of selling to people who just see dollar signs." He paused. "But it also means something bigger. William Webb earned that gold through honest labor in brutal conditions. He hid it to protect his family's future. For generations later, that future is now. I'm not going to let anyone steal what he preserved." "You're going to fight Crestview," Carlson said. "Not a question. I'm going to make it impossible for them to win. And I'm going to do it legally, publicly, and permanently." Over the next week, Marcus executed a strategy that combined military precision with small-town solidarity. Brennan's newspaper ran a front-page story about the Webb family legacy, Henry's 60 years of community service, and the predatory development tactics threatening local heritage. The article didn't mention the gold, only that historic family documents had been preserved and were being properly archived. Mrs. Patterson's petition grew to over 800 signatures, impressive in a county of 12,000. The county commissioners, facing unexpected public resistance, quietly shelved the eminent domain discussion pending further review. Marcus hired a California attorney specializing in mining claims and historical property rights. The original claims William filed, properly researched and authenticated, remained potentially valid under certain interpretations of 19th-century mineral rights law. The attorney began the complex process of determining what, if anything, those claims meant in modern legal terms. And Marcus sold 3 of the gold bars through a reputable auction house, establishing clean provenance and generating enough capital to settle all outstanding debts, pay property taxes 5 years in advance, and set up a trust fund for the garage's preservation. Torres called twice more, each time raising his offer. Marcus declined politely and stopped answering numbers he didn't recognize. Crestview Development announced they were exploring alternative sites for their commercial plaza, a quiet retreat that local business owners interpreted correctly as defeat. 2 months after finding the cache, Marcus stood in the garage on a cold December morning, watching his breath fog in the unheated space. He'd spent the previous week installing new equipment, modern diagnostic tools that would let him reopen Webb's Automotive as a functioning business. Not because he needed the income now, but because the garage deserved to continue the work Henry had started. The gold remained in Sacramento, most of it, a resource he could access if needed but felt no urgency to liquidate. It had waited 170 years. It could wait longer. What mattered more was the letter he'd received yesterday from the California attorney. Williams Mining claims, after extensive research, held mineral rights to parcels that had been incorporated into a state park in the 1960s. The rights were essentially worthless for extraction purposes, but they came with a twist. As the legitimate heir to those rights, Marcus could negotiate a conservation easement, permanently protecting the land from development in exchange for a modest annual payment from the state. William Webb had won the lottery after all, not through the gold he'd buried, but through the claims he'd properly filed and the land he'd respected enough to document carefully. His fortune hadn't been measured in gold bars but in legacy, in the preservation of something beautiful for generations not yet born. Marcus thought his grandfather would appreciate that irony. He was organizing tools when Ethan Patterson, Mrs. Patterson's teenage grandson, appeared in the garage doorway. The kid was 17, smart but directionless, the same age Marcus had been when he'd last worked in this space with his grandfather. "Mr. Webb? My grandma said you might be looking for help fixing up the garage." Marcus studied the boy, seeing himself at that age, needing purpose and finding it in the patient instruction of a man who understood that teaching mechanics was really teaching responsibility, precision, and pride in work done right. "You know anything about engines?" "Not much. But I can learn." "Then grab those work gloves. We'll start with the basics." As they worked together through the afternoon, Marcus teaching and Ethan learning with the quiet intensity of youth seeking mentorship, something settled in Marcus's chest. The legacy wasn't the gold. It was this, the passing down of skill and care from one generation to the next, the preservation of spaces where honest work mattered and community connections held stronger than contracts. His phone buzzed with a message from Trevor. "Saw the news article. You found it, didn't you?" "The cache." Marcus typed back carefully. "Found something better. Found home." The response came quickly. "Good for you, brother. Stay safe." That evening, Marcus walked the property as sunset painted the Iowa sky in shades of orange and purple that rivaled anything California could offer. The house needed work, the garage needed updating, and the future remained uncertain in 1,000 small ways. But the land was his, paid for by William's labor and Henry's patience and Marcus's own willingness to fight for what mattered. He thought about Sarah Webb, waiting in Iowa for a husband who never returned, raising children alone on hope and dwindling resources. Thought about the generations that followed, each one carrying the weight of almost prosperity, the knowledge that somewhere their ancestor had struck fortune, if only he'd lived to claim it. William had claimed it after all, just not in the way anyone expected. He'd secured his family's future through careful documentation and hidden treasure, through faith that eventually the right descendant would understand the gift being offered. Marcus was that descendant. And the gift wasn't gold. It was choice, the freedom to decide what kind of legacy he'd build on the foundation 4 generations had protected. In the garage that night, he opened Henry's final journal one more time, reading the entry he'd practically memorized. "The garage holds more than tools. When I'm gone, it belongs to Marcus. If he's smart, he'll find it. If he's wise, he'll understand what it means." Marcus understood now. The treasure wasn't the gold bars or the mining claims or the property that developers coveted. The treasure was the unbroken chain of men who'd valued something beyond immediate profit, who protected the future even when the present demanded everything they had. That chain didn't end with Marcus. It would continue through Ethan Patterson and whoever else needed the lessons this garage could teach, lessons about precision and patience and the quiet dignity of work done well. Outside, the November wind rattled the metal walls, carrying the smell of coming snow. Inside, Webb's automotive held steady, ready for another generation of service to a community that remembered loyalty and rewarded faithfulness. The gold would wait. The land would endure. And Marcus Webb, veteran and heir and guardian of legacies he'd only begun to understand, would honor the trust 4 generations had protected. Some inheritances couldn't be sold or divided. Some were meant to be lived, one careful day at a time, in spaces where the soil remembered everything and the future grew from seeds planted long ago. Spring came to Johnson County with the kind of slow certainty that made you believe in second chances. The frost retreated from the fields, birdsong returned to the oak tree, and the garage on Ridgeline Road opened its bay doors to let in air that smelled like renewal. Marcus stood in the doorway with his morning coffee, watching Ethan Patterson work beneath the hood of a 1987 Ford pickup, the kid's movements growing more confident with each week. 3 months had passed since the California trip, 3 months of building something that felt less like a business and more like a continuation of interrupted conversations across generations. The gold remained mostly untouched in Sacramento, a secret Marcus shared with only his closest circle. He'd liquidated enough to secure the property and establish the garage on solid financial ground, but the rest waited with the patience that precious metals seemed to possess naturally. There was no rush. William Webb had taught him that much: fortune meant nothing if you didn't live long enough to spend it wisely. "Mr. Webb, this carburetor's got me stumped," Ethan called, wiping his hands on a rag that had probably been doing the same job since Henry's time. "The float's sticking, but I can't figure out why." Marcus set down his coffee and crossed to the workbench, examining the disassembled parts with the careful attention his grandfather had taught him 20 years ago in this same space. "See how the pin's worn on this side? Creates friction when the float tries to rise. You need to replace the whole assembly, not just clean it." Ethan nodded, absorbing the lesson with the hunger of someone who'd found purpose in understanding how things worked. His grandmother had confided that the boy's grades had improved since he started working at the garage, that he'd stopped talking about dropping out and started researching mechanical engineering programs. Small victories. The kind Henry Webb had collected for 60 years, helping one kid at a time find direction through the simple act of teaching them how to fix what was broken. The morning brought a steady stream of customers, farmers needing equipment repaired before planting season, commuters with check engine lights they'd been ignoring all winter, Mrs. Patterson dropping off her ancient Buick for an oil change and staying to chat about the upcoming town council meeting. "They're voting on the historic preservation ordinance tonight," she mentioned, accepting the coffee Marcus offered. "Thanks to all the attention from the Crestview situation, people are thinking differently about development. The ordinance would protect buildings over 50 years old from demolition without community review." Marcus had attended the planning meetings, had watched his small act of resistance against predatory development grow into something larger, a community conversation about what they wanted to preserve and why. The garage, with its documented history and renewed operation, had become a symbol of that conversation. "Your grandfather would be proud," Mrs. Patterson said quietly. "Not just of saving this place, but of what you're building. Henry always believed that teaching a skill was the best gift you could give." After she left, Marcus found himself in the office, surrounded by filing cabinets full of service records and the ghosts of careful bookkeeping. He'd been slowly digitizing the old records, creating an archive that documented 60 years of community service, one oil change and transmission repair at a time. But today he pulled out a different file, one he'd created himself. Inside were letters, real letters written on paper, sent to addresses he'd researched through county records and genealogical databases. He'd been trying to find Sarah Webb's descendants, the family that William had left behind when he went west in 1849. Marcus had only vague family stories about distant cousins somewhere in Illinois, but William's letter mentioned Sarah's sister in Springfield, and that had given him a starting point. The response had come 2 weeks ago, a carefully written email from a woman named Catherine Morrison who taught history at a high school in Peoria. She'd done her own family research, had traced her lineage back through her great-great-great-grandmother Sarah Webb, and had always wondered what happened to Sarah's husband who'd disappeared into the California gold rush. Marcus had told her everything. sent her digital copies of William's letters, photographs of the mining claims, the story of how 4 generations had protected a legacy without fully understanding it. He'd expected skepticism or demands for a share of the gold. Instead, Catherine had responded with gratitude. "My students study the gold rush every year," she'd written. "They see it as ancient history, disconnected from their lives. But this, a real story about a real family member who lived through that history and left evidence of his experience, this makes it real. Would you be willing to share William's documents with my class? Not the financial details, but the human story?" Marcus had agreed immediately, understanding that this too was part of the legacy, the teaching, the connection between past and present that made history matter. Today's mail brought Catherine's latest letter, this time handwritten on good paper, the kind that suggested importance. "Dear Marcus," it began. "I've been thinking about your invitation to visit the garage and see where Henry preserved William's legacy. My spring break is in 2 weeks, and I'd like to bring my family, my husband and our 2 daughters, to Iowa. Not to claim anything or dispute ownership, but simply to see where our shared ancestors' journey ended up. Would April 15th work for you?" Marcus read the letter twice, then pulled out his phone and typed a response. "April 15th is perfect. Looking forward to meeting you all." The days leading up to the visit passed in a blur of preparation. Marcus cleaned the garage more thoroughly than necessary, organized William's documents for display, and even repainted the house's front porch, a project he'd been postponing since inheriting the property. Ethan helped after school hours, asking questions about the gold rush and the family history, his curiosity turning the work into something closer to a research project than simple labor. "Do you think William knew?" Ethan asked while they were replacing rotted porch boards. "That his gold wouldn't be found for so long?" Marcus considered the question seriously. "I think he hoped it would be quick. That he'd go back to Iowa that fall like he planned, reunite with his family, build the life he'd earned. But he also knew the risks, that's why he hid it so carefully and documented everything. He was protecting against exactly what happened. And your grandfather, he knew but never went after it. He protected it instead. Kept the information safe until someone in the family was positioned to handle it properly." Marcus hammered in another board, feeling the solid thunk of nail meeting wood. "Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is wait, trust that the future will honor what you've preserved." April 15th arrived with the kind of perfect spring weather that felt orchestrated specifically for important occasions. Marcus had closed the garage for the day, hung a sign explaining private family gathering, reopened tomorrow, and spent the morning arranging chairs in the office and setting out the display of William's documents he'd prepared. Catherine Morrison arrived at noon in a well-traveled minivan, her family spilling out with the contained chaos of people who'd driven several hours. She was in her 40s, with kind eyes and the easy manner of someone who spent their life explaining complex things to teenagers. Her husband Tom was quiet and observant, while their daughters, 12 and 14, had the skeptical curiosity of adolescents who'd been promised something interesting. "Marcus," Catherine said, extending her hand with genuine warmth. "Thank you for having us. This means more than you probably realize." The afternoon unfolded with the gentle rhythm of strangers becoming family. Marcus showed them through the garage, explaining his grandfather's work and the community role the business had played. He showed them the floor safe where William's documents had been hidden, the careful preservation that had protected fragile paper for decades. In the office, spread across Henry's old desk, William's letters and journal lay protected in archival sleeves. Catherine read them with tears in her eyes, her daughters leaning close to see their ancestors' handwriting, making the past suddenly tangible. "Sarah never remarried," Catherine said quietly, touching the plastic protecting William's letter to his wife. "She raised 3 children alone, worked as a seamstress, and lived until 1891. According to family stories, she always believed William would come home. Even after they received news of his death, she insisted he'd just gotten delayed, that he'd walk through the door eventually with stories of California and gold in his pockets." The image broke something open in Marcus's chest, the thought of Sarah Webb waiting year after year for a reunion that death had made impossible, William's carefully buried fortune useless to the family that desperately needed it. She deserved to know, Marcus said. Deserved to have the security William earned for her. But in a way, she did. Catherine's oldest daughter spoke up, surprising everyone with her insight. I mean, we're here now because of what William did. We know his story because he wrote it down and people kept it safe. That's worth something too, right? Not money, but knowing he tried, knowing he cared enough to plan for them even when it didn't work out. The girl's wisdom, delivered with the unconscious profundity of youth, settled over the group like benediction. Legacy wasn't just what you passed on materially, it was the stories, the evidence of effort, the proof that someone had cared enough to try. Marcus made coffee while Tom and the girls explored the garage, asking Ethan about the tools and the work with genuine interest. Catherine stayed in the office, reading through William's journal entries, occasionally laughing or shaking her head at some detail of Gold Rush life. He was funny, she remarked. I expected the writing to be formal, stilted, but he had this dry humor about the absurdities of camp life. Listen to this entry. Dalton challenged Peterson to a duel over a shovel this morning. They stood 20 paces apart for 10 minutes before realizing neither owned a pistol. Settled the matter by drawing cards instead. Peterson won the shovel but lost his hat in the bet. They laughed together, the sound filling the small office with warmth that pushed back against decades of solitude and silence. Before Catherine's family left that evening, Marcus made a decision he'd been considering since receiving her first letter. He retrieved one of William's original letters from the archival display, the one addressed to Sarah, and held it carefully. This belongs with your family, he said, offering it to Catherine. The historical documentation is important, but this is personal. William wrote it to Sarah. You're her descendant. You should have it. Catherine's hands trembled as she accepted the letter. Are you sure? This is part of your inheritance too. The inheritance isn't the paper, Marcus said, echoing something he'd only recently come to understand. It's the knowledge, the story, the connection. I have all of that now. And I have the gold, which frankly, your family has as much claim to as mine. William earned it for Sarah and their children. Tom stepped forward, perhaps sensing where this was heading. Marcus, we didn't come here expecting anything. We're not going to make claims on the gold or the property. That's not why Catherine wanted to meet you. I know. Which is exactly why I want to share it. Marcus had thought this through carefully, had consulted with lawyers and accountants about the cleanest way to handle what felt morally right even if the legal obligations were murky. William's fortune was meant to benefit his family, all of his descendants, not just the branch that happened to preserve the documentation. I'd like to establish a trust, funded by the gold, that supports both our family lines and honors William's original intent. The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable, just heavy with significance. Finally, Catherine spoke, her voice thick with emotion. What did you have in mind? Over coffee at the kitchen table, Marcus outlined the plan he'd been developing with his California attorney. The gold would fund a trust with two primary purposes: preserving the Webb family properties and history in Iowa, and providing educational scholarships for descendants of William and Sarah Webb who wanted to study history, engineering, or any field related to understanding and preserving the past. William valued education, Marcus explained. His journal talks about regretting his limited schooling, about wanting his children to have opportunities he never did. This feels like honoring that wish across generations. Catherine's daughters had been listening quietly, but now the younger one spoke up. So kids like us could get help paying for college because our great-great-great-grandfather found gold in California? Exactly, Marcus confirmed. And kids like Ethan Patterson, who's not a blood relative but who's learning the skills Henry Webb spent a lifetime teaching. The trust would extend to students working in the garage's apprenticeship program too. Family isn't just blood, it's also the people you choose to teach and mentor. The conversation continued late into the evening, details being sketched out, ideas being refined, the shape of William's belated legacy finally taking form in ways that honored both the gold he'd found and the values he'd died protecting. When Catherine's family finally departed, promising to return for the trust's formal establishment, Marcus stood in the driveway watching their taillights disappear down Ridgeline Road. The spring night was cool and clear, stars visible in ways they never were in cities, the kind of sky William must have slept under during his California years. Marcus's phone buzzed with a message from Trevor. "Heard through the veteran network that you're doing something with your find. Setting up scholarships or something? Man, that's solid. Your grandfather would be proud." Marcus smiled and typed back. "Just finishing what William started. Took a while, but some things are worth the wait." The weeks that followed brought a different kind of busy to the garage, not just automotive work but the infrastructure of legacy building. Lawyers drafted trust documents. Accountants structured the gold sales to minimize taxes and maximize the endowment's longevity. Catherine worked with her school district to develop criteria for scholarship applications that would attract serious students without creating unnecessary barriers. And through it all, the garage continued its primary work, fixing vehicles, teaching skills, serving the community that had supported the Webb family through 4 generations of quiet persistence. Marcus found himself thinking often about his grandfather during those weeks, wishing Henry had lived to see this resolution. But in another sense, Henry was present in every decision Marcus made, in the careful attention to detail, in the prioritization of community benefit over personal gain, in the understanding that wealth meant nothing if it didn't serve a purpose larger than individual comfort. The trust was formally established on June 3, exactly 1 year after Henry's death. Marcus, Catherine, and their respective attorneys gathered in Carlson's office to sign the final documents, creating an entity that would outlive them all if managed properly. The William and Sarah Webb Legacy Trust. Catherine read from the charter, her voice carrying the weight of family pride. Established to honor the vision and values of William Webb, 49er and family man, and Sarah Webb, who raised their children alone with courage and grace. May this trust support future generations in their pursuit of knowledge, skill, and understanding of the past that shapes our present. They signed, witnesses added their names, and what had been buried treasure became something that could actually change lives, fund dreams, and honor sacrifices made 170 years ago in California goldfields and Iowa farmhouses. That evening, Marcus hosted a small celebration at the garage, just close friends and family who'd supported him through the complicated months since Henry's death. Mrs. Patterson brought a cake decorated with a tiny gold nugget made of frosting. Deputy Collins showed up in civilian clothes with beer and congratulations. Ethan and his parents came, the boy beaming with pride at being included in what felt like important adult business. As sunset painted the sky in shades of amber and rose, Marcus stood outside the garage with his coffee, watching the small crowd inside share food and stories. The land stretched around him, unchanged and eternal, witness to generations of struggle and triumph, loss and recovery. He thought about William Webb, dying alone in California with his fortune hidden and his family unreachable. Thought about Sarah, waiting in Iowa with faith that gradually hardened into grief. Thought about the generations between them and now, each one carrying the weight of almost prosperity, so close to the breakthrough that never quite arrived. Until now. Until Marcus, broken and searching, had found not just gold but purpose in honoring what had been protected through patience and faith. The inheritance had come with a funeral, a flag, and a garage full of ghosts. But it had also come with a mission that Marcus was only beginning to understand, the work of turning tragedy into legacy, loss into gain, buried treasure into living benefit. Some fortunes took time to mature. Some required exactly the right moment and the right person to bring them into the light where they could serve their intended purpose. Marcus Webb, veteran and heir and guardian of stories that deserve to be told, had finally found his place in the chain of men who'd valued tomorrow more than today, who'd protected the future even when the present demanded everything they had. The gold was just gold, metal in the earth, inert and patient. But the legacy, that was alive and growing, spreading roots through generations like the oak tree his grandfather had planted decades ago, giving shade and shelter to people who would never know the hands that had prepared the ground. Inside the garage, someone started telling a story about Henry Webb, about the time he'd fixed a transmission for free because the family couldn't afford the repair but needed the car to get to medical appointments. The story sparked another, and another, 60 years of small kindnesses and quiet service, remembered and recounted because they'd mattered to people who'd been helped. Marcus listened from the doorway, understanding finally what his grandfather had known all along. Legacy wasn't what you left behind when you died. It was what you built while you lived, the skills you taught, the people you helped, the values you demonstrated through action rather than words. The gold was William's legacy, but it was also the smallest part of what he'd given his descendants. The real inheritance was the example, the documentation, the proof that one man had cared enough to plan for a future he'd never see, to protect what he'd earned even when death came calling earlier than expected. That inheritance, the one that couldn't be spent or divided or locked in a safety deposit box, would continue as long as people remembered the story and chose to honor it through their own actions. Marcus raised his coffee cup in a silent toast to the men who'd come before him, to William and Henry and all the others who'd understood that some things were worth more than money, that legacy was measured in lives touched rather than dollars accumulated. The spring night settled around the garage like a blessing, cool and clear and full of promise. Somewhere in California, the land where William had found his fortune continued its patient existence, protected now by conservation easements that would preserve it for generations who would hike those hills without knowing the history buried in their soil. And here in Iowa, on land that had witnessed struggle and sacrifice, the garage stood ready for another season of service, teaching, and the quiet work of building legacy one careful repair at a time. The inheritance was complete. The treasure was found. And the story that had begun with William Webb in 1849 continued forward into a future he could never have imagined but would surely have approved, because the family he'd tried so hard to provide for was finally, belatedly, receiving the gift he'd earned through courage and preserved through careful planning. Some seeds take generations to sprout. Some fortunes require patience measured in decades. But eventually, if protected with faith and tended with care, they bear fruit that nourishes not just individuals but entire communities, creating abundance from what had been buried and forgotten. The land remembered. The soil kept its secrets until the time was right. And when that moment finally arrived, the harvest was worth the wait. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.